Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first video that we have created about an article from the Journal of Awareness-Based Systems Change. A few months ago, Otto and I wrote and published an article called Fourth Person, The Knowing of the Field. And it's an article that's really had tremendous resonance out in our community and beyond it. And so we wanted to return to that, explore it, share some of the feedback, and how it's refined our thinking since.
So in this video clip, we'll do three things. One, we'll revisit the essence of the argument, go into that. Number two, we want to share with you what we learned from the significant feedback that we got from all of you. And number three, we want to share with you an exciting idea how we believe we could move this entire work going forward starting next year.
So we put this article out into the world called Fourth Person, The Knowing of the Field. And what came back to us was such interest in the article. 28,000 reads and downloads, hundreds of comments as we posted it on LinkedIn and reposts. We have it's being translated into 5 different languages. Many people have written to us with really considered detailed feedback. And there's a study, actually, that's a spin-off study from this, a collective autoethnography at George Washington University to really dive in and explore the concept and the experience more deeply. And so when we wrote this paper, what we're really trying to do is to articulate and to unpack an experience, a kind of knowing that we believe is really quite common, but is underarticulated. It isn't really spoken of in the sort of public realm. But it's an essential kind of knowing because it's really at the root of any creative endeavor. And it's knowing as well that that we believe is always available, but it does need a certain kind of presence and attention to be able to access it. And so this is the concept that we wanted to explore and that we dove into using sort of the frame of mainstream and current science and epistemology.
So why fourth person knowing? They are in action research, our field, but also in many other related fields. It is common to differentiate between 3 forms of knowledge and knowing. First person, subjective, so my intrapersonal experience. Second person, intersubjective, so that's the interpersonal experience. Then third person, objective. So if I put up a camera, if I record kind of everything I can see and count and measure. So that's kind of the third person or objective knowledge that we can attain. And then in our experience, and kind of this experience really grew out of 2 decades of facilitating, co-facilitating transformation journeys, collective transformation journeys in communities. And what we realize in these contexts, we are a very significant moment in these journeys is when we, and in theory, we would refer to these things around the bottom of the U when there is a subtle shift is happening and a subtle reconnection between who I am as a person and the larger community that I'm part of, and the future possibility kind of that are connected with our current moment. There is this deeper threshold. What we learned is if you really hold that space, if you can cross that threshold together, it changes everything thereafter. And if you can't, right, you're much more likely to reenact more of the same. So that's what we noticed. And we thought it's worth to consider it a new knowledge type, sui generis, because yes, it has aspects of the first person, second person, and third person knowing, but it also has distinct aspects that are going beyond these traditional forms of knowing, specifically 5 characteristics that we identified when we reviewed the data.
And so how did we come up with these 5 characteristics? What was our process for exploring this kind of knowing that we've talked about as knowing that comes through me but is not of me? So we drew on the data that we have from our engagement in awareness-based systems change initiatives, ecosystem activation through events like initiatives like Gaia Journey, our capacity building work through programs like ULab, and a huge variety, as Otto said, of systems change initiatives in different settings. And we interwove that data with our own sort of personal and professional experiences to, over time, kind of boil down and ascertain these 5 characteristics that we'd like to share with you now.
The first characteristic is fourth person knowing is experienced as something looking at me that isn't me, a beingness that is not me and yet does not manifest in my or our absence. So what's an example of that? An example of that is how we in our work conceptualize the term future. And future, in our view, is not something distant that happens in another place in another time to different people. Future is utmost personal. Future is essentially a possibility that is looking at me or looking at us as a community of change makers because it depends on us or on me in order to manifest. So again, the future is a possibility that is looking at me or looking at us because it depends on me or on us in order to manifest. That's an example.
And so how do we know fourth person knowing? Like, how does it show up in us? And what we found through our own experience and through our interviews and our engagement with the data is that although fourth person knowing shows up subjectively, it shows up in us as individuals, it has a really distinct feel and sense from knowing that might originate from me. What often shows up is a feeling of warmth, but there's also a sense of perception decentering. So perceiving not so much from me and within me, but from a much wider field. People also talk about shifts in the way they experience the space, an experience of time slowing down, a difference in the quality of light. And so all of these sort of sensory experiences that show up individually, but don't feel as though they're coming from us, are sort of indicators or point to an experience of fourth person knowing.
The third characteristic is a sense of heightened possibility. And so when, we often, in the context of our work, we differentiate between the small s selves and the capital S self. So the small s self is my current self, kind of my persona in the current moment. And the capital S self is kind of who I could be, who I could step into, my highest future possibility. And basically what fourth person knowing does is it connects you somewhat more intimately, somewhat more directly, somewhat more closely with your capital S self. And what it means is that what might be possible for you feels more like in reach. And that's kind of really what we observed in these occurrences and instances. A future potential previously experienced as out of reach moves inside the horizon of what feels doable or possible.
And so what are some of the settings that make connection with fourth person knowing more likely? And what we found are that generative social fields, so collectives where there is a quality of presence, a shared attention, and a degree of shared intention that allows people and individuals within it to see and to hold a greater whole. And then not just to be able to see that whole, but in particular, to then be able to turn and look at oneself through the lens of the whole. And doing that is a subtle but a really profound shift, because what it does is it allows people and sort of leads them to reconfigure their own understanding of their selves, their work, and what is theirs to do, their particular piece in a greater whole. And that connection gives that piece, much more a greater sense of significance, right? And meaning and wholeness. And so that's one of the ways that that generative social fields help to connect with and foster fourth person knowing. Don't know if there's anything for you there, Otto, before we go on.
So what you just described, Eva, is really from an organizational point of view of utmost importance. If you look at the field of organization and management and organizing and leadership, all new and innovative forms of organizing, right, and leading and managing are really boiling down to the same thing, which is flattening of hierarchies and opening up of silos towards forms of organizing that are much more fluid and flexible and dynamic. But as we all know, right, this flattening of hierarchies is only fun and it's only successful if it is accompanied with a mindset shift from silo to systems view, or you could just say kind of from an ecosystem awareness to an ecosystem awareness. And ecosystem awareness, meaning an awareness where, yes, I see my own silo, I see my own part of the whole, but I'm also aware of the whole, of what it means for others, and therefore can factor that into my own decision making. So that is really a key foundation for any kind of new way of an innovative way of organizing to be successful, including the DAO type of organizing, the decentralized autonomous organizations. And that's why, it sounds maybe a little abstract here, but it is of utmost practical relevance when you move it into the field of organization and management.
And that actually does connect directly to our final phenomena of the five.
Which is fourth person knowing tends to activate longer term generative social fields that give rise to sustained and significant practical results. I remember Eleanor Roche from Berkeley, kind of she once said kind of that this once you connect with these deeper sources of knowing, kind of that this knowing can be shockingly effective. And so why would that be? And I mean, in all honesty, is it really the case? We see evidence for that, but of course, the jury is still out, right? We are very early in this research also. But the interesting phenomenon that we have seen is that once this shift happens in a social field towards a generative social field, which really means there is the establishment of a deepened connection between the key players across boundaries. Once that shift has happened, you can move from new ideas. Yes, it generates more ideas. There's constantly new ideas. But the more important thing is it helps you to implement new ideas into embodied action with much more ease. So it moves away all these boundaries that usually kill these new ideas from being implemented. And that's perhaps one explanation why in many of these cases we have seen that the sustained significant practical results, they don't happen right away, but they happen with a certain time delay but then they tend to increase their significance. So that's something we are still observing, we are still researching, but this belongs to the key characteristics that we identify.
That's kind of the article in a nutshell. So the response, right? Really, as I talked about, incredible volume of response, but what is it that people are responding with? So first of all, incredible recognition. People saying that yes, this gives language to how I understand my experiences, even how I understand the work that I'm doing. One of the groups that got together to really reflect on this piece was a group in China who had particular resonance with the experience of knowing that comes through me but is not of me, and that experience of expanded possibilities. And then for some people it was this gives a frame for retrospectively understanding really key moments in their life when something shifted, when there was a knowing about sort of their next steps, or very powerful experiences in groups for which they didn't have words. And then other people are, within that recognition are also talking about different gateways in nature, stillness, the kind of collective environments where there's high levels of trust and authenticity, or where something about the process has helped to give people a connection with their sense of being a part of humanity, historically and in the present. And so I think the volume, the depth, and the quality of this resonance, certainly has been significant. And I guess, as we read these reflections and think about it, I mean, I'd be curious to ask you, Otto, are you surprised? Are you surprised that 28,000 people have taken a look, or we've had that many downloads of this article?
No, I'm not. I remember we had a conversation before, right? We published it, and that was exactly what I responded. And not it's because I can see the future or anything like that, but it's just because I have experienced that in many contexts before, right? It's not a surprise at all. And I am, having worked with communities around the world in many different contexts, I know that what we are talking about here is a widely shared experience. It's not, and at first you may think, well, this is a very, very special experience for very, very unique and individual people, right? One here and the other over there. No, not true. It is a widely shared experience that is experienced not by everyone, but by many of us who deal with profound innovation, who deal with significant amounts of where something is changing, where we go through a process of letting go and letting come, and who participate in the current moment that we are going through as humanity, right, on this planet, in a somewhat perhaps more aware way, right? There is a deeper shift that's happening, and once we become aware of that, once we pay attention to that, that's something that is quite distributed. And I first personally stumbled into that when in the 1990s and in the early 2000s, I did these interviews for Theory U. And I realized how many of the innovators have this very, very personal relationship to the future possibility that they dedicated their life towards to bring it into being. And it was not just, oh, this is my brainchild, I just dreamed that up. It was almost like a felt responsibility to something that depends on you to manifest. And that's really, I have seen it and experienced it in so many different contexts, not a surprise at all. It's just not talked about because it sounds a little weird, perhaps, right? And we don't have frameworks for that. And that's exactly why we call it fourth person knowing. Because yes, it's subtle, but that doesn't mean it's abstract. It's very concrete, it's very personal. And fourth person knowing is pointing essentially at a deeper layer, at a more subtle layer of human experience that's always there, but rarely paid attention to.
That's really interesting because you know, For me, I would say I did have a bit of surprise in this, and the surprise was actually more about um, the way in which people express themselves in response to this. So just how heartfelt the experience of engaging with this work was. So somebody, saying, I read this over 2 days with my heart pounding, or, I was moved to tears in reading this, or a piece of feedback I loved, which was somebody saying, thank you for acknowledging the realness of what's been denied by science for so long. And so there was something for me there around, wow, this, I mean, it's really there, held collectively and maybe a bit denied, something that we collectively don't yet have the frames for, or don't yet quite allow to come in more fully. And so that was, yeah, that was a piece for me that felt a bit surprising, but also significant. And so maybe that, like, as I was just coming towards the end of this reflection about what's significant.
Yeah. So maybe just, and perhaps that's a segue into our last point, Eva. So the only way I would take issue with you just what you just said is denied by science, because so the modification I would suggest is denied by the current format of science, because the reason we wrote this piece, you and I, is that essentially we want to extend the framework of science. And science is essentially data-driven, right? You let the data talk to you, right? That's the essence of it. And that's what we believe in, right? So it's kind of, but the problem is, right, in the old framework of science, we only look at exterior data, right? And what we are saying is, in the extended concept of science, we need to also monitor the data that comes up with the more subtle, through the more subtle realm of our experience. It is data, but it's more subtle, and it refines, it needs a refined methodology to be surfaced in proper ways that are reliable and that give us, and that are supported by a method. And that's essentially why we wrote that piece. And that's a segue really into our last piece.
Absolutely is. So where do we go from here? How do we, this has resonance. There's a validity that comes with that resonance, but how do we move it forward? And so, we both know very well that this work can't move forward unless there are more people, more researchers exploring, engaging with this kind of epistemology, but developing methods for exactly what you just said. How do we access and make visible and work with the more subtle aspects of knowing? And how do we do that in a whole variety of settings and contexts towards systems change, right? So in practice. And what we propose, or what we know is needed, are sort of young researchers focused on this. Ideally, the structure that we have available is through doctoral research. And what we aspire to do is to create a doctoral fellowship that brings together sort of young researchers and their faculty from different institutions around the world, working in different areas, what we would call different acupuncture points, but who can convene, who can cross-pollinate, and whom we can accompany through their research. And by doing that, we will just advance the work in so many different ways, but predictable and unpredictable. And so really what we're looking for now are partners and funders who'd be interested in joining us for that kind of an endeavor and that kind of journey.
Yeah, and maybe in closing and zooming out just a little bit, we all know kind of we as a global community, as a global system, go through a profound period of transitions. And so we have profound institutional transformation going on in all sectors, but probably one area where it's most significant and perhaps also lacking most in many ways is education, in particular higher ed, right? And so we know that we in the Presencing Institute are committed to democratize access to these methods and tools, really to shift our learning, not just learning from the past, but also learning from the emerging future. And how do you democratize, right? Essentially by updating and upgrading the methodological foundations of our institutions of education, particularly higher ed. And the key for that is the next generation of educators. That's really why the PhD programs and the doctoral programs around the world are the absolute key for their perhaps the most difficult to attain and yet the most significant key for really transforming and upgrading our institutions for education. Because why, as a society, do we have institutions of education and institutions of higher education? In order to really capacitate the next generation of learners to co-sense and co-shape the future, right? And that's why this extension of the underlying framework from first person, second person, third person knowing towards including the fourth person knowing, we believe is one of the most significant leverage points for the transformation of self, the transformation of our institutions, and the transformation of our planetary systems in a way that make them more regenerative, more equitable, and more aware.
So thank you for joining us for this video. As with the first sharing of this article, we invite you to continue to share with us your reflections and your feedback. You can do this here in the YouTube chat. You can reach out to us directly. We'd love to hear from you.